Sorry. Getting confused. Can we turn on this computer? Down here? Start. Evening. I realized afterwards I had given you a major menu of 3 very different, very strong films, and it must have taken some time to process them. Now that you've slept on it, did anyone have any insight on these 3 radically different? There's a dramatic shift from New Earth to Spanish Earth to Power on the Land, and interestingly, they all have the word Earth or Land in the title, don't they? Did anyone have any reflection afterwards on those 3 films and these radical shifts?
Do you want us to talk about it, Thomas?
Well, if anyone had deep thoughts or shallow thoughts.
Not very, very shallow thoughts, actually. There was this reversal that I noticed, especially considering the fact that. Would you mind just read the letter that's in it?
What should I?
So there was this reversal that I noticed the city and the village. You know, especially in not in New Earth, but in the Spanish Earth, and the last one that was Power and the Land. There was a stark contrast between the village, or rather the peri-urban or the rural, as we call it, and the urban. Uh, so very shallow thoughts, as I said.
No, not at all. It's very important. I think when Evans went to the Soviet Union,
Uh-huh.
he was very impressed with the campaigns going on there to bring together the villages and the city, to communicate, to create communications and mutual relationships between the peasants and the workers. And for him, I guess it was the next step to create this village in Spain that was the microcosm of this revolutionary society, and a village that was helping to feed the city, the Madrid under siege. So he saw a very organic relationship between the village and the city. And in Power and the Land, it was just one more step. In fact, it was so overstated in Power and Land about how rural America is the essence of our society, right? They kept saying this. The family farm, in fact, it isn't even a village, it's a family farm. And
Which is why I say peri-urban, not
Yeah.
really rural, but rather peri-urban.
yeah,
Because there's a distinct connection between the city and the village in both these films. There's also one thing that I noticed in New York.
yes,
There were a couple of shots where the workers were shown supping.
yes, weren't those wonderful shots? I mean,
Supping.
Evans is so interested in everyday life, and it's not just about work, but it's also about having your supper, uh, looking after your kids.
Yes, but I especially found those shots interesting because they seem to reflect the the entire procedure of the human endeavor eating up the sea. Human endeavor that is eating up the South Sea, creating land out of water. Eating up the so that bowl of soup for me, uh, almost reflected was a symbol, almost of the sea being eaten up by human hands.
Well, I think maybe you studied literature a little bit too much.
Yes, yes, yes. I teach literature, right?
No, I'm just kidding. I think that's an interesting point. But for me, it's also about the quality of everyday life. He's very interested in the quality of everyday life. Remember all the attention he paid in Borinage to where the fuel comes from, what they're eating,
Mm-hmm.
what their health practices are.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he does a kind of materialist analysis
Yes, he
of
does.
everyday life.
Yes, he does.
On the one hand, he's also the poet and prophet of work.
Mhm.
When he showed the New Earth to workers' audiences in the Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
the legend is that they said to him, "You're not really a bourgeois. You've told us you're bourgeois, but you understand working class labor so well that you don't need to disguise yourself as a worker here in the Soviet Union. You must really be a worker because you understand work." Remember the shots of the workers lifting the heavy stones,
Yes, yes, yes.
and the angle was so perfect.
Yes, yes.
They said, "You really understand physical labor," and it's true. He really watched, and the bricklaying also. So, and those beautiful scenes. Sanmeet and I were talking about the beautiful scene with a file of workers carrying the very heavy metal
pipe,
pipe.
and their arms, winding around each other.
It was like a ballet.
It was.
But it was such hard work and so graceful. So work and everyday life, and the fact that he interweaves work and everyday life in this village in Spanish, or with the military defense of the city, is the major political point he's making, isn't it?
In the Spanish herd, there was also this one glimpse, a couple of shots of this lady, Dolores. I forget her.
Ibura, La Pasionaria.
Pasionaria. Yes. So could you reflect a little bit about her? I mean, this is of course not relevant to the.
There she is, right here.
Yeah.
She just died recently.
Yes.
In her 90s. She lived after the defeat of the government in Spain. She went into exile in Moscow and lived there for the remaining 50 years of her life, 60 years of her life.
She was also a very important journalist, if I remember.
Yeah.
She edited I think the party mouthpiece for quite a few number of years.
Well, I don't have a lot of comments on her. I think it's important that he shows a woman political leader in the lineup. He is also very sensitive to women's work. Almost every film he made shows women doing laundry. And he knows how much, not only women, everyone hates doing laundry.
Yes.
And he shows it. And this for him is always the symptom of social goals, of social organization. If women's work is made doable, then a society has achieved its goals. He shows that in almost every film. But I don't really have a lot to say about La Pasionaria.
I have a small question. Yesterday you were referring to Julian, isn't it? Julian. Yes, you mentioned this after we went out. Could you talk a little bit about how they did this entire thing?
Okay, that relates to one theme I wanted to bring up with you. We talked about socialist realism and how Evans was inspired by their goal in the Soviet Union to bring people alive in the films, to make characters documentary parallels to the characters in fiction films, but more authentic, more real. And he called this, he used two concepts. He called it personification. Personalization. He also used the word vivification, making characters come alive. So he thought Spanish Earth was going to be the first chance he got to create characters. He forgot that there was a war going on, and you can't create characters under fire. Everyone said, Evans, you are crazy, you're going to get yourself killed. Take protection, take shelter. And he didn't get killed, fortunately, but he didn't have the time to do the elaborate planning and collaborative work in order to build the characters. So we see Julian in only 4 little scenes. He wanted to flesh him out into a much more living personification of the fighter,
Okay.
right?
So of the rural individual turned fighter.
Yeah, and in fact, Julian disappeared on the front. He was probably killed. So they were stuck. So the brilliant editor, who happened to be his girlfriend at the time, Ellen Van Dongen, should maybe have gotten co-credit on the film. As it stands now, he would give co-credit sometimes to his cinematographer, but he also should have given it to her. She created synthetic, really ambitious scenes with Julian, with shots that didn't even belong there. Do you remember the scene where there's a reunion, he comes back to the village?
Yes.
We get all the reaction shots of all the women, his grandmother and father and everything. Those shots did not belong there at all, but she created a synthetic scene.
We were talking about this today, yes.
Of homecoming and welcoming. So he failed in his attempt to create life and blood, fleshed out characters. It's really only in The Power in the Land, the last film we looked at, where he had his way, finally. And with this farm family, with Hazel and what's Parkinson's first, Bill Parkinson, and especially the little boy, creates really living documentary characters. Two older sons are a little bit more of a shadow, and the poor little girl who's sort of being socialized to clean lamps and do laundry doesn't really.
And then also learns how to use the electric iron.
Yes, she doesn't really come alive very much, but the couple and their little boy become really flesh and blood characters. So that was an important goal for him. And he tried in Spanish Earth, it didn't work. He tried in the 400 million that we're going to have a glimpse of in a minute, or later on this morning. It didn't work. But Power in the Land was the first chance to put into practice this ideal of characters in social skills.
Which is where I have a question. This is where I have a question. Not really a question, more like a sense of wonderment. Because I do not know much about filmmaking or about documentary as well. This is very new for me. But where does one draw? Let me rephrase that. Is docufiction then an essential or a very suitable or a very significant aspect of documentary then? Because there is docufiction, isn't it?
Yes.
And where does docufiction occur in case of?
I think we need to be careful about terminology. I think docufiction is more or less a recent hybrid.
Yes, it is.
Which maybe real life characters perform a script or something like that. But kind of collaborative. Well, actually, I used the term in the reading you did, mise en scène. For this kind of collaborative, dramatized work, where Evans would work with these two peasants and his big camera and his tripod. You are going to reenact this process of making the irrigation line, and I'm going to film it, and just play yourself, but they're clearly performing for the camera. And it's a kind of collaborative performance they're giving. So in the classical documentary, up until around 1960, this was the standard, and everyone presumed this is what you did when you're making a documentary. Around 1960, we got a new aesthetic because of the new lightweight technology, whereby people could actually pretend the cameras weren't there and perform their own lives as if it was an everyday situation, and then the camera could observe. But in the classical documentary, the camera could not observe. Well, it tried, and let's just actually go through this. In the reading you did, you noticed I demarcated 3 different modes of documentary in Spanish Earth. On the top, the mise en scène, the collaborative dramatization with the peasants building the irrigation, for example. Next, what I call spontaneous, usually with a handheld camera in a scene of chaos or violence or unpredictability. He's using his small handheld camera rather than the big tripod, and that takes up half of the film. This spontaneous, you could also call it observational, and you could also call it proto-direct. Why proto-direct? Because it anticipates this new style that came in around 1960 called direct cinema, where you may have heard it referred to as cinema verite. So he really anticipated that style with this spontaneous mode. I mean, if you're in the street of a village and you're being bombed, these women were, you can't set up the tripod. You can hide in a doorway with your camera, come out when the planes are gone, go back in. And that took up half of the film. And then the third category I call newsreel, meaning he borrowed the lexicon of the commercial newsreel companies who filmed public political events on their trucks in very static setups. And so this rally of the army was that kind of a setup. It was stationary. You could bring in the big cameras. You could bring in the microphones that only the newsreel companies had. Evans didn't have any microphones except for recording a little bit of wild sound here and there. He never did sync sound shooting in the field, only in these scenes where usually it's political speech making or political ceremonies. You've all seen this kind of work, especially in maybe the films division, who specialize in, here in India, who specialize in cabinet ministers opening dams, right? That's what these kind of ceremonial static.
Or laying foundation stones.
Laying foundation stones. Ceremonial static, boring, newsreel type footage. So there's a little bit of that also in the film. And we can also think about a kind of what I would call a landscape or pastoral mode. This is the pantheistic nature lover Evans admiring the earth, the Spanish earth, which is after all the title of the film. There are very beautiful shots of the countryside, right? And also of the city. We could also remember there's animation in the film, especially with the maps. I want to also mention, I already have in fact mentioned the dialectical montage. By that I mean the intercutting between village and city. I remember in the final climax to the film where he intercuts between the irrigation, is shot here, and the soldier firing. So by intercutting these two opposite iconographies, he distills the message, the essential contribution that agriculture is making towards the war effort, but also a kind of symbolic. Here I lapse into English literature study again. The symbolic value of those beautiful images of the irrigation, not only in terms of productivity, agricultural productivity, but in terms of meaning of creating a new society through running water. It's a very beautiful image. So dialectal montage, commentary, several of you commented on the narration. Remember, we talked about how this was a big achievement for him in terms of restricting the voiceover, which was called the voice of God, and normally people really hated it, restricting it to only 1/3 of the running time of the film. And everyone praised Hemingway's voice and the style of his commentary. It was a real breakthrough. I forget who brought this up with me, but how did the rest of you find that voiceover commentary? It's quite legendary. Any comments about that? And the gossip around it, I mean, the background story is that they first hired Orson Welles to do it. Orson Welles' voice was too slick. He got fired and was replaced by an amateur speaker that is Hemingway. The understanding was that people would trust the narrator if he wasn't a slick professional, if he was like an ordinary guy, sort of nervously reading the script. And it worked. And it also has a kind of Hemingway literary style as well. It's terse. It doesn't overstate, does it? This is the face of men going into war, period. It doesn't go on and on and on, elaborating and telling us things that we actually could see. So that was a big achievement for this film. This was a real breakthrough. And then compilation is another mode that we should talk about, but it's not especially important in Spanish Earth, but it is extremely important in the New Earth, where this beautiful imagery of the land reclamation and the harvest and the cultivation of the land is suddenly interrupted by archival shots, stock shots, found footage, and is completely overturned. So Evan's experience as the editor of found footage of commercial newsreels came to good use in that film. I don't know whether you remember the passages, the end of the film where suddenly everything is different. So compilation is another thing to keep in mind, because in the next lecture when we talk about Evan's work during the war, compilation became a really important tool in wartime propaganda films that he would be making, and we'll come to that later. Any questions about these three principal modes in Spanish Earth? Okay, so let's actually move on to this other slide. Here are a few frames from the film just to jog your memory. That one of the men, again, collectively carrying the tube, irrigation tube, is almost a recapitulation of the one from New Earth, isn't it, with the men carrying the giant pipe. The thing about watching all these Evans films over the years, 60 films in total, is if something works, he does it again. So he probably said to these farmers, you carry the pipe, wait, I'm going to set up the tripod, you carry the pipe, you move when I say go, and it's this incredibly beautiful shot. And again, it's an image of collective community effort, right? That is about, very much about the politics of the film. Okay, I've entitled this slide, The Ambiguities of Coalition, the Iconographies, I should have said iconographies of populism, sorry. What do I mean by coalition? Well, we're now in the Popular Front. There had been a radical shift in international left-wing politics at mid-decade. The proletarian militantism or dogmatism that we saw in New Earth, denouncing the capitalist system, was a thing of the past. Moscow and their allies around the world saw the rise of fascism in Europe and in Asia as a very important threat, and decided that they needed to form alliances with liberals and progressive people. So suddenly they stopped denouncing socialists and liberals and progressives as well as fascists. Sometimes it sounded as if the socialists were as evil as the fascists up until around 34, 35. You're used to this kind of sectarian left-wing politics in India, aren't you? Where one party denounces the other, and this suddenly ended, and then became the spirit of coalition and alliance. And there's a political fallout from this kind of political move. How would you describe the politics of the film? Do you get a sense if there's a very different sense of political sensibility from either Borinage or New Earth? Any sense of that in Spanish Earth? Was the word fascist used? When? In fact, it's used once in the film only, and that's when the president of Spain gives a little speech.
Yes, yes, yes.
Isn't that interesting that the enemy is not named?
But the category is named.
It's a kind of oblique description of the enemy. Who are named are the German and Italian
Phalangists. Phalangists.
They're not named as phalangists, though. But who are named are the German and Italian soldiers who are aiding the fascist forces. But they are named with almost a kind of sympathy. Do you remember the scene where the dead Italians are shown and they say, Hemingway says, we read their letters home. They thought they were coming to Ethiopia and they ended up here dead. Remember that? That's a very touching scene in a way. These are the enemy dead. So the dogmatism of the earlier period has shifted to a kind of more sympathetic or a more empathetic sensibility. So the enemy is not named, and it's the same with the Moroccan soldiers who were the mercenaries employed by Franco and the rebels. Were you surprised that Hemingway praised them as soldiers? So there's a kind of a complexity to the politics around two sides. Any other sense of politics in the film? Is there any mention of Soviet help to the nationalists government? No, right? So these Americans that Evans was collaborating with clearly decided we're not going to set ourselves up for a kind of censorship by some kind of pro-red discourse in this film. We're going to keep things a little bit oblique and ambiguous. So there's no naming of left-wing politics. It's a kind of oblique populist sensibility, as we saw in Valiant Pal, isn't it? This is our land. We're cultivating our land. We're protecting our land. This is the politics, isn't it? Anything else? You are probably all familiar with other documentaries from the mid-30s about the struggle between fascism and democracy. Have you all seen Triumph of the Will, the Nazi propaganda film from 1936? I thought everyone looked at that on YouTube when, at the age of 8. You haven't seen Triumph of the Will? Who has seen Triumph of the Will? Oh, I'm surprised. Think about the iconography of the military, of the army in Spanish Earth. What did you notice?
Come again?
The depiction of the military, the government army that is defending Madrid in Spanish Earth. How were they depicted? Well, in this shot, you're village boys being trained by Julian, right? Scary squadron of jackboots. No, there's these like ordinary boys, village boys.
And they seem to be enjoying.
They seem to be enjoying. They don't know how to march. They're completely undisciplined, right? Whereas the Nazis knew how to depict their army in a way to scare people with jackboots and goose steps and daunting uniforms and helmets, right? So this is the notion really of the people's army that was very important for this cause. Ordinary people defending their lives and their land, not professional soldiers. And you hardly see professional soldiers anywhere in the film. If you do see professional soldiers on the battlefront, what do you see them doing? Sitting around reading newspapers. Again, this is Evans' interest in information, media, literacy, You remember the shot of the soldier very carefully writing his name or something? This man has just learned to read, clearly. He was just fascinated with literacy. Or you see the professional soldiers getting a haircut, remember? The barber shop. So it's a very different sense of the army than you might see in films of the other side. Hope you will all go home and look at on YouTube at Triumph of the Will to corroborate what I just said. So when I say that the communists and Moscow are not named, there is one tiny shot of a man that's in a big sheepskin helmet. Did you see him? Big sheepskin hat, who looks like a Cossack or a Russian Tartar or somebody, right? Did you notice him? That's the only evidence that the Soviets and the communists are involved in this war as well. He may have been part of the international brigades. Do you know what they were? They were the Allied volunteer squadrons from abroad that came to the defense of the Spanish Republicans. There was a battalion from the US called the Lincoln Brigade. There was one we had from Canada that went over to Spain called the Papineau MacDonald Battalion. So every European and Western country had a squadron there defending the Republic. Are they mentioned? No. They're avoiding any kind of trouble in the home countries, especially the USA, because the USA was officially neutral. They had to distribute the film. They didn't want to run into trouble with the authorities, with the censors. So they avoided any kind of explicit political aiming. And they did receive criticism for this. And this is really what I'm referring to as the ambiguities of coalition. The politics are a kind of loose, sentimental populism, right? We're defending our land. We're feeding the besieged citizens. We're looking at the atrocities inflicted upon ordinary people by planes in the sky, but we're not naming the very specific political stakes of the war. There's one little moment that's quite explicit in the film, however, which I think was fairly safe. Do you notice that the bread in the village had the Union stamp on it? So this was maybe as far as they could go in terms of having a left-wing agenda, being explicit in the film. You got pro-union, making a pro-union statement. That probably wasn't going to inflame the censors in the U.S., but otherwise it's a little bit ambiguous. Okay, when I ask about the iconographies of populism, I mentioned the symbolism of irrigation. Populism was a very important political movement in the 1930s. Now it's become a dirty word because of Donald Trump. But then it was a progressive force, a kind of non-aligned left-wing political energy that helped elect in the US the Democrats to power for 4 successive terms, and was a feature maybe also of popular fronts that came to power in France and Spain, and even in the UK, the Labour Party came to power in the 30s. What would you say are the features and images that belong to this current of populism that you might see in this film? Any ideas of this? We talked about the ragtag army. We've talked about the bread. We've talked about the irrigation. Any other iconography that strikes you as belonging to this ideology of we the people, ordinary people, everyday lives? Well, think again of the title of the film, Earth. And once you think of that, then you remember there's a lot of earth, there's a lot of land in the film, isn't there? And the fact that all three films are named either land or earth is important. The fact that the plowing and the irrigation of the land is one of the principal activities in the film, the defense of the land. The iconography of the soil, of the earth, the land is very important throughout this whole current, not only in Evan's films, but in other documentaries of the 1930s. Have any of you seen any of the other American documentaries of the 1930s? The Plow That Broke the Plains or The River. I urge you to see them if you're interested. But even in India, you can find currents of this kind of iconography. In a film like, for example, Mother India, where plowing is such an essential activity, and harvesting, the heroine just goes ecstatic first at the moment of her first harvest, doesn't she? It's such an important symbolic moment. Or a Bengali film like Do Biga Zameen, right? There, the title also is land, right? And it's connected to a kind of peasant, rural politics as well, an agrarian politics. In the U.S., the Depression had really affected rural people, agrarian people, very dramatically, and we've inherited a great deal of imagery of these affected people. The migrants who had to leave their land and move to the cities, or the sharecroppers who were starving to death because of the droughts. So this kind of agrarian imagery is not restricted to Spanish Earth or Power in the Land, but it's really a current of the day, a political and cultural current in many Western societies, but also in here and in other non-Western societies as well. I guess once World War II came along, this pattern yielded to other kinds of imagery, but it's really an essential part of 1930s culture. So keep that in mind as well. Sorry. We're going to talk about Power in the Land in the next lecture. And we just have a little bit of time left to talk a little bit more about Spanish Earth and the New Earth. You read in your reading for today about how Evans was part of a movement in documentary filmmaking of the 1930s, pushing towards a new synthetic form of documentary. Documentary filmmakers were summoned to move away from the newsreel, which they saw as a kind of superficial, topical kind of journalism, to a deeper, more synthetic kind of filmmaking. And
The essay, first essay you talk about international solidarity genre and European genres.
all right, I think I defined three categories to be kind. the international solidarity genre where progressive people in one society are championing the cause of people in another pre-revolutionary society like Spain. There's a kind of exoticization going on, of course. Other people's struggles. Everyone chip in, come to the support of the Spanish peasants. And it has a kind of ethnographic color to it as well. American audiences will be fascinated by the donkeys and the costumes of the peasants. Shot where the man is drinking in the field, which is like a fascinating ethnographic moment. So these films of international solidarity have a kind of ethnographic spirit as well as this objective of applying distant struggles to one's own backyard. So the measure of the success is not whether Even's audiences were able to contribute to buy ambulances for the front in Spain, but whether they realized similar struggles were going on in the US. And there are those who would argue that because his politics was so ambiguous, that he may not have fully succeeded in doing that. The second category I believe I mentioned was would be applied to the Vertov films we looked at, where filmmaking in a post-revolutionary society is participating in the construction of a new future utopian ideal society. So this is why in the Vertov film, there's so much glamour attached to the laying of tramway tracks. Tramway tracks are sort of a mundane and boring object, aren't they? But they have a kind of glamour in that film because these tramways are building utopia, aren't they? And then the third category, I'm getting spam from Vodafone, sorry. Where was I? Third category, where filmmakers are addressing political and social issues in their backyard. And I guess we could look at New Earth and Power in the Land in that respect. There's no exotic struggle of faraway people in colorful clothes, but there are political issues in one's backyard. They may be glamorized or poeticized or aestheticized as in Power in the Land, but they're meant to strike people up in terms of their everyday lives. So these three categories are still with us. If you go to a documentary festival here, as I'm going to be doing at the end of January in Mumbai, I'm sure we'll be able to divide the social issue documentaries into those three categories. They're perennial categories, aren't they? I mean, they don't include other obvious genres like nature documentaries. But in terms of social issues, that's I think that's a kind of perennial taxonomy that we can use. Okay. Oh yeah, so Evans was part of this push among American filmmakers to develop a deeper, more synthetic kind of documentary. And he kept asking himself when he was in Spain, he was very insecure about what he was doing and whether he was successfully making a film. He was so frustrated because this fancy script he took with him in his pocket he couldn't use because of the violence of the front line. So he kept asking himself, am I making a film or am I making newsreel shots? So in his mind, there was a sharp division between the superficiality and immediacy of newsreel shots and the depth of a film. So for him, Spanish Earth and Power of the Land embodied these goals of making new, deeper, hybrid works. The use of dramatization and mise en scène, for example, was very innovative for the period. Who would have thought that a farmer from Ohio could become a movie star? He's a terrible actor, but there's a kind of authenticity in the face of this man, isn't there, as he's reenacting his life for the camera. So this use of dramatization was an important objective in the development of the new hybrid style. Their other goal was more profound political analysis, and my argument about the obliqueness and avoidances of the politics in Spanish Earth makes one wonder how profound political analysis really was. But on the other hand, by avoiding this year's political categories, this year's political names, and pushing to understand more perennial values like land or work or loyalty, maybe that is the kind of deeper kind of politics. That's a good question for us to think about. I think one of the reasons that Spanish Earth looks so good 80 years later is that it does not truck in the immediate stakes of 1937. It does identify lasting values. There's a movie TV of the week about the making of Spanish Earth. Did anyone see that? Called Hemingway and Gellhorn. It starred Nicole Kidman as Hemingway's wife. It's really trashy. For that reason, you will probably enjoy it. And Evans is one of the characters in it. And it's a very sentimental story about making a film on the front line and about the love life of a famous actor. But none of the politics are even imagined in this film. It's a film about romance and stereotypes. And even the historical periodization of Madrid in 1937 is made very superficial indeed. So I think it would be an interesting double feature to look at Spanish Earth alongside this TV movie of the week. It came out maybe 5 years ago. Okay, I think we are now I think we've covered the territory. Was there anything anyone wanted to add about Spanish Earth before we? Yes.
You have mentioned about the Hollywood influence also in this Spanish Earth. In what else, apart from this vessel scene?
Ziju is asking about the Hollywood influence. These filmmakers wanted to get into the theaters. They wanted to compete with Hollywood product. They opened their film in Hollywood and they had a reception with movie stars like Joan Crawford. They were really thinking about the theaters in Hollywood. And so developing characters like Julian would have, in their minds, got them into the theaters. As it turned out, they played only in very specific art house cinemas in major cities or on campuses. They didn't succeed in their goal. But Power on the Land, however, did play in theaters. It reached an audience of millions. And you can imagine why. it was a well-funded, sentimental film that is actually quite moving and has live characters in it. So Power on the Land sort of proved to them that this path was the one to take. And then the war came, and they weren't able to because there were other priorities during the war. So history, film history is like that. Expectations are constantly flouted by the emergent, by history. Evans used an expression of history putting a knife in my back repeatedly throughout his career. So I've left a little time at the end of this lecture just so we can finalize the discussion about the assignment, which you are going to be, hopefully, most or all of you presenting on the last day. We talked about an approximate 10-minute presentation, either an individual presentation or a joint presentation by two of you. And my suggestion was that you pick a short clip of a film from the internet. We have very good streaming here in the room. Maybe 3 minutes or so that corresponds to either of the two categories of the seminar, committed documentary or sexual representation. And then you provide an analytic and historical framework, analysis of the film. Does this sound good to everyone?
I had a different sort of suggestion, if I may. First, could we shoot our own documentaries?
You already asked me that, and I said yes, you are welcome to do that.
And they would also like to do the same.
So we're going to have 4 documentaries.
Not much, 5 minutes each, not more than.
Okay. Would anyone else like to do that? that protected people from falling over the cliff.
Oh,
And of course, someone has reclaimed the metal.
okay.
And so this allowed my friend to walk to the very edge of the cliff. I think this is very symbolic. I'm not sure how.
I thought maybe it's somewhere nearby this area.
It looks a little bit like
Yeah,
it, doesn't it?
similar.
Are we going to wait for Arjun or we'll wait one more minute, okay? Am I on? No.
I'll get that.
Thank you. Oh, lovely. Thank you, and that you all did for me. What does that mean? The proxy server is refusing connections.
Oh,
connection, internet connection, display হচ্ছে internet connection, internet এইটা চলছে
আরেকটা বলতে ওটা প্রদীপও পারবে
We have to have a connection. Just like that. Yes, please. an engraving of the war, disasters of war by Goya in Spain. Abhishek was asking me about citations of Vermeer in Power in the Land, and they're obvious. Great Dutch painter who, interestingly, is also discussed in your initial reading by Martin Jay as being involved in a kind of descriptive project rather than a perspectival project. And I'm actually not going to go into that, but I just thought I would show you it. I think if you look at this beautiful image and then compare it to the Evans images of the farm women in their kitchen, the echo is really unavoidable, isn't it? I wasn't intending to go into this. Any questions before we move on? The Evans scholars who are very much focused on his auteur continuities in his work are very interested in his relationship with painting, especially with Dutch painting. The other two painters that are used are Bruegel and Van Gogh. And so, for example, in Power in the Land, you remember the scene with the boy wandering around the farm with his sunflower, and he passes a stunted tree. All of these critics say Van Gogh. It's a very interesting avenue, and I didn't really go very much into it, but I'll let you do that on your own if you would like. Let me just quickly call that up, since we just saw the film. Wonder if this is going to come up with anything. There are lots of trees. I don't know how stunted they are. Right, so that's a little bit what's going on. And okay, so any questions about that before we come back to the lecture? Okay, the purpose of this lecture is to cover Evans' work made during World War II. It's sort of interesting that this champion of peace, among other things, became known as a poet of war, and at least a third of his films are about war. It wasn't an obsession of his. He just happened to be living in the 20th century and be making films about the world. War was inevitable as a subject matter, unfortunately. And so it's not only the Spanish Civil War, but World War II, Cold War, the Vietnam War. He has this stature of developing this image of the world that relates iconography of terrible violence and suffering with images of everyday life, resistance, and production of life, reproduction of life. And so this is an opportunity, this lecture, perhaps to think about that a little bit more. The image on this title slide is the lobby card for the film he made in 1942, an entirely compilation film made very, very quickly to enlist American sympathy for their new Russian ally. As I mentioned before, in August 1939, Stalin and Hitler made a pact of non-aggression. And this lasted until Hitler invaded Russia, the Soviet Union, in summer of 1941. And immediately, Russia joined the Allies, and it became the task of Americans in solidarity with Russia to drum up support for this country that had previously been considered the enemy or the communist menace. So this film, this is a feature-length compilation film made entirely of archival footage, was Evans' contribution, co-directed with another member of the Hollywood left-wing, Louis Milestone. By this time, Evans had moved to Hollywood to participate in the filmmaking of the war effort and was teaching film production at University of Southern California. What I find interesting and amusing about this lobby card is that his name and the name of Milestone is in tiny, tiny, tiny print, and it's the narrator, the Oscar-winning actor, Walter Houston, who gets the large print. And even though he had a negligible role, he just read the script in the film. But that's how publicity works, doesn't it? If you've got an Oscar, your name is on the poster. And Walter Houston was also associated with his most famous role, that of President Lincoln, and so brought to this project a kind of Americanness that was very important for this campaign to solicit support for the new Russian ally. So this was about 6 months before the Americans entered the war themselves after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in that December. And there on the lobby card, you can see all smiles, a woman partisan guerrilla fighter in the Russian forest and one of her compatriots. So it's a very interesting piece of evidence. And by and large, throughout this footage that he used, which had all been supplied by the Soviets, women play a very important role as fighters, as workers, as agricultural producers. Obviously, because men were at the front, well, women were also at the front. But there's an amusing sequence where women are being forced to learn how to drive tractors in this film. Soviet women, and they're very good at it, and it's an interesting sequence in the film. So we're not going to go into our Russian front very much, simply because I don't have a copy, and it's not really one of Evans' most important works. But what I would like to do is to start by coming back to the film made during the official period of American neutrality, Power in the Land. Remember, Evans and other communists were not touching war in 1940-41 because of the Stalin-Hitler Pact. And by coincidence, this beautiful film about peace and agrarian harmony came onto his plate, and he made this film. So we haven't really had a chance to focus on this film yet in our discussion. So I'm just wondering how powerful you think Power in the Land is. I introduced the film by saying it was light, because I wanted you to stay for the screening. And we just had some very heavy films. But how did you find it? It has been called some interesting things. One French critic called Power in the Land one of Evans' finest works. Another American historian of documentary called it Evans at his best, a combination of poetry, politics, and photography made into a statement of uncommon beauty and strength. A wonderfully evocative piece of Americana, a classic film document that is too often overlooked. So I was probably wrong in using the word light, if these critics are to be trusted. What did you think? Can an advertisement for the power cooperatives for electricity that ends in a family having a shiny new electric stove and electric lights, can this be like a great work of art, a great work of documentary, Even's finest work? How did you like it? Why did I do that? There we go.
Somewhere in your essay, where somewhere in your essay, you have called this film a laboratory. I couldn't understand why.
I think he was experimenting with new techniques. Here was a chance, peacetime, a well-funded film, relaxed, living on this beautiful farm in the country, lots of time in his hand, surrounded by friendly people. Let's experiment with all these new techniques that I want to develop, like working with amateur performers, like creating textured and living characters, developing techniques for using real people in documentary film. That's what I meant. And he wrote a lot about this technique that he was trying out in this film. Unfortunately, he didn't get to do it again until after the war, but he was pretty proud of what he'd done with his family. How did you feel about the characters?
In fact, the essay says that this is the only film which has family as a theme.
Well, he sort of suddenly rediscovered family because I think he thought it was such an American value. And this, bohemian intellectual, urban intellectual, who by this time had was not really a family member himself. His mistress was his editor, and he'd gone through several girlfriends already, and he was still married to someone he was no longer with. He really wasn't like the role model of familial life, was he? But suddenly he discovers this sentimental portrait of a nuclear family, a husband, a wife, and 4 children, and creates this believable, ideal image of this family, unless we think it's not believable. Is it believable? Yeah. No?
Indian context, yes. Indian context. From where we come, it is
Why do you say that?
because it is believable.
There we go.
Because the kind of context we come from and the family values that we have, the film and the characterization and the portrayal just looked very natural to us. So I think it is believable. I don't know about the Western society and how the family structures are.
Well, I think it's true to the uh, um, template that existed in American culture at the time. And I feel it's slightly redeemed by the fact that all of the members of this family are shown hard at work. You can obviously be turned off by gender stereotyping in the film. I mean, the woman's expression of satisfaction because her husband likes the food she's just pulled out of the oven. I mean, as if this is her whole goal in life to please her husband's palate. But in fact, she's shown as a very, very hard worker and with a key role in the economics of the farm. So there is a slight redemption. But I think the pressure on Evans and his producer, remember it was a state-funded documentary, and Roosevelt was having trouble in Congress because he was losing his majority, and the Republicans were very pro-family. And I think there was a pressure on these filmmakers to create acceptable images that would not rock the boat. So they decided, I think they came upon this harmonious image of family. Film has sometimes been critiqued as Norman Rockwell-ish. Does that ring a bell for you? Or I'll call up Norman Rockwell, who was like a famous mainstream magazine illustrator of the time, known for his kitsch and sentimental portraits of family life, white American family life. That's maybe his most famous painting. And he illustrated so many magazine covers during this period. He's been accused of, Evans has been accused of sort of matching Norman Rockwell's iconography, but to me there's slightly more depth and complexity to his work than there is there. Where were you going with that, Margarita? Were you thinking along some particular line about thinking about that family?
Somehow I felt that this film does not really gel with the other films that you showed. You know, it was not a typical Evans's film, and that's why the family also appeared to be a very hypocritical. I mean, it's not the synthetic form that you talked about. So it was not a very organic family that was
It's
shown.
been interpreted in many ways. I mean, for one thing, Evans comes into new social contexts with each project and absorbs influences from that context. It's also been interpreted in terms of his own personal life. Here is a man in exile, a refugee from the Nazis, who is making a film as Holland is occupied by the Nazis. It's been argued he missed his family, and he would not see them until after the war. Is that, I mean, there has to be more to it than that, but it's sort of...
It was a state-commissioned film, right?
Yes.
So obviously it was hypocritical. Because there's the state-sponsored apparatus involved there. So the mission, the idea that it was hypocritical, it was staged. That's what. So it's hypocritical in some way or the other. I don't think hypocritical is the right word to use for it though. It would rather be a facade sort of a thing that was constructed, especially to create a sense of, as you said, Roosevelt was having a lot of trouble in Congress at that point of time because of his obvious, way of work. And then
to project the idea of the perfect American family. You know, the
Even said his cinematographer, especially the cinematographer whom he recruited from left-wing circles in Hollywood, really wanted to organize farmers in Ohio and lead a revolution of farmers, but they were repressed by the producer and the apparatus around the film. So the only glimpse of anything like this politics comes in the cooperative sequence where they're discussing togetherness, working together, coming together to form a cooperative. And the word cooperative was a real dirty word with the Republicans.
synonymous with communism,
Absolutely.
commies.
So they have to soften the word cooperative with this kind of folksy poetry. Just hasn't lasted.
I also think that Power in the Land had a certain miasma of disappointment in the first part, especially that part where the 2 cans of milk have soured and they fit only for pigs now. And when Bill Parkinson receives the letter, he reads it, the cans are taken away, and he puts it in his back pocket and he walks away. What we can see is only his outline against the sky. So, in his being a very busy farmer, his gait is always very fast. He walks fast because he's a farmer. He has a lot of work to do. There's a lot of purpose in most of the scenes where he's seen walking. But there, he's tottering. He's almost tottering because that sort of disappointment is something that has not happened because of his own work, but because of the faulty structure that he lives in. So I think that there is also a lot of criticism that Evans has embedded in the film.
Okay, and I think you're right in pointing to that scene, because Evans was very proud of that scene and wrote about it in terms of acting techniques for amateurs. Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, what I would like to do now is quickly glimpse, tiny little clips of 2 others of his war films from this period. And we will come back to the issue of Evans as a poet of war after we've seen those clips. Okay? Yeah, I'm using my pink notebook. Okay, here is, remember with Spanish Earth, Evans embarked on the war against fascism, and immediately after he finished Spanish Earth, the crisis in East Asia was intensifying, so he immediately got involved in China's defense against the Japanese invader, and made, with his American collaborators, made 400 million in China. 400 million was the population of China at the time, and now it's triple that, right? Can we get the lights, please? So it starts with the scene of refugees escaping from the Japanese bombardments of the coastal cities. This little clip. Did I lose it? Yeah, I lost it. and heritage, and it was the first of 4 filmmaking projects in China he made over the rest of his life. 1937, 1938, 1965, 1971, and 1986. So this discovery was a real and profound one. And I wouldn't want you to come away with that in terms of dismissing the orientalization or exoticization of this solidarity documentary. It was really an authentic discovery on his part, and it's really a beautiful passage, I hope you agree, of these ancient monuments suddenly being buffeted by a kind of metaphoric dust storm. He had a terrible time in China, even worse than in Spain. He was hounded by the Kuomintang, who Sun Yat-sen's successor, the Chiang, Generalissimo Chiang, because they were very suspicious of their intelligence reports had probably informed them who Evans was, and they were very suspicious of this American crew making a film, and censored him furiously, tracked him everywhere. It was a terrible experience, and he thought he just wanted to destroy all this footage that had been made against all of these pressures, but in fact, it turned out to be a pretty interesting film. Held up pretty well. As with the Spanish film, the importance of the balance between conflict and violence and the stakes of conflict are essential. In all of his war films, he tried to identify the values at stake, not just the immediate strategic and political challenges, but the larger and deeper values at stake. And here, in terms of cultural heritage and the land, I think he was doing his best to identify what those values were. The reference to the painters who could paint the wind is a very interesting poetic reference. He would come back in the 1980s to make a film about the wind in China, aspiring himself to be a painter who could paint the wind. His last film was called Story of the Wind. So,
Tale of the Wind.
What?
Tale of the Wind.
Tale of the Wind. That's the translation of the French. So I urge you to see that if you can. We won't be showing it, unfortunately, in this seminar. Any questions? Yeah, I also want to show you a clip of his Canadian film, because I love this film because it was made in my country. It was the only time he ever came to film in Canada. This was 1942. Russia had entered the war, and his old friend John Grierson, who was head of the Canadian National Film Board, recruited this distinguished foreign visitor who was unemployed in California to come to Canada to make a film about the Canadian Navy, which you might think is a pretty boring subject, but he tried to make it exciting. And again, he faced a lot of institutional pressure, couldn't really make the personalized film that he wanted, but it's a lively and enjoyable film. I don't think he went as far in identifying the values at stake in the war as he wanted to, but we'll just show you a little clip. And how do we get there? This one you can see yourselves, streaming it from the National Film Board of Canada, nfb.ca. This is the only Evans film that you can legally stream. The rights holder, Marcelina Lorena Evans, thinks she owns it, but she hasn't been able to convince the original producer of the film, the National Film Board of Canada, that she does. So they're continuing to stream it. She knows better than to sue them. And she's not interested in this film anyway. as well as the poet of work and play. And even though he couldn't develop the characters, John Grierson didn't give him enough money to develop personalized characters. It's a pretty interesting project. I don't mean to imply that the war years don't mean to imply that the war years were really productive for Evans. In fact, they were frustrating and often fallow. Often he was unemployed. And even worse, towards the end of the war, the most exciting project he'd been assigned was for the US Army called Know Your Enemy Japan. It was to be a major full-length compilation film about Japanese society and culture, which would show Americans in depth the society that they were in conflict with. Towards the end of the war, red baiting increasingly came to the surface. And so this very ambitious project to analyze Japanese society with its traces of feudalism and modern industrial capitalism just came to an end, and he was fired. So his most ambitious project was fired, came to this sorry conclusion. Previously, 2 corporate sponsorships had happened along the same lines at the beginning of the war, so it was a terribly frustrating experience for him. The good thing was he was able to write his first autobiography in his moments of idleness. And as I said, he taught some of the time at the University of California. So what we have to show for the wartime years is our Russian front, action station, and power on the land. At the end of the war, as we mentioned in the first class, he got a wonderful plum job with the Dutch government. He was going to be the Dutch John Grierson. But then red baiting happened there as well. He got fired from there, and the good news is that he made Indonesia Calling instead, which we've seen and which is really one of my favorite films. So he was not alone in having frustrating moments in his career. All filmmakers develop unsuccessful projects, scripts that they have to throw out, funding that never comes. But for him, I think the war was especially a fallow period, and it did not end there. In the next class, we'll be talking about Evans during the Cold War, in which he was based in Eastern Europe, under the sponsorship of the new communist regimes in Eastern Europe, and that's also another interesting episode in his career. Do any of you have any comments or questions about these 2 excerpts I've shown you from the China film, in which a peaceful landscape and heritage monuments are part of the war against Japan, or this Canadian gung-ho documentary about sailors dancing on shipboard? Any comments or questions? Yes? Is that a hand? No? He thought you had your hand up, Arjun, or were you just scratching your ear? He thought a lot about his responsibility as a political artist during the war and the kind of depth that he should reach in terms of explaining to his audience what war was all about, not just about bombings, but about the defense values. And I just want to read a passage he wrote mid-war where he was explaining how a political artist needed to contribute to society's morale during war. This was a speech he gave at the Writers' Congress in 1943 in Los Angeles at the University of California. He was talking about what he called the morale film, the film that filmmakers should be making in societies in conflict. And I'll just read this passage. Quoting a Soviet authority on the subject, Sergei Kurnikov, he described three kinds of morale. The first kind is the fatalistic attitude, which can be expressed thus: while it's war, there's nothing we can do about it, let's make the best of it. Our super fatalistic Muslim troopers used to say simply, Kismet. He's quoting this Soviet authority on morale films. The second type of morale is being developed among the more advanced peoples. There I put in brackets, Sikh. It's strange that he would use such language, racist language, but as we know from the history of the left, they were not always in tune with the advances of the anti-colonial struggles that were going on around them, especially the European communist parties very often came out in favor of maintaining the empires, whether in Holland or the UK. So the second type of morale is being developed among the more advanced peoples. It is of the kind called football team spirit on campus and esprit de corps on the parade ground, and is based mainly on a desire to show the so-and-sos the stuff we're made of. The third kind of morale is rooted in a deep understanding of the values for which the contest is being waged, and on a personal and direct link between those values and the individual fighter. A deep understanding of the values for which the contest is being waged, and on a personal and direct link between those values and the individual fighter. So those are very high ambitions. I'm sure he felt very discouraged when he was saying these things, because he may not have felt that he was able to succeed in these ambitions in our Russian front or action stations or even 400 million in Spanish Earth. But it indicates how these ambitions remained in place throughout his career and throughout the rest of his career. And when we come back to the next chapters in his career, tomorrow we'll be talking about the Cold War and the year thereafter about his films in the anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggles. We'll come back to this issue of whether a deep and personal understanding of values in relation to the individual are achieved. So we shall stop there. It is now 1 o'clock. Any comments or questions before we wrap up? You wanted to make an announcement, Abhishek.
Yeah, just a quick announcement. The grading thing has got nothing to do with the issuance of the certificate. It's anyway being issued. So as Tom says, like the grading isn't obligatory, because I realize some of you are leaving midway on the 9th as new. This is again, like, just to remind, this has got nothing to do with the certificate, which has implications on the tidying of API and all.
Do I get a certificate?
Only if you
Why would you need a
need.
certificate, Tom? What do you need a certificate for?
I don't know, just to feel valued.
You are already valued.
More than that, he can't get a certificate certified by himself.
Oh no, we'll give you a certificate next month.
Thank you.
আমাদের